bring forward any chat questions to the Q&A part of the session. There will be one Q&A break during the presentation and one towards the end. I have with me a team of Western Power engineers who have worked on the project here with me. We also have Dr. David Bones, the lead consultant from GHD. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Zara Jabiri, who is the head of regulation and investment assurance. She is the lead sponsor for the project. Now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Zara.
Thank you, Sabina, and good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this Western Power Forum. Before providing you some background on the importance of the technical rules and the importance of this session, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we are meeting on and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. The Western Australian energy sector has been facing significant changes over the last decade, driven by uptake of the PV systems, the changes in the generation mix towards the more renewable generation, and new technologies such as energy storage solutions, standalone power systems, and microgrids. While a transition to renewable in the generation mix creates more opportunity for lower cost and lower emission energy, the irregular nature of these sources can pose challenges in managing our network assets and maintaining the reliability and security of the network. To better plan and manage the changes in the energy sector, in March 2019, the Energy Minister Bill Johnston announced the state government's energy transformation strategy. The vision of this strategy is to provide safe, secure, reliable, lower emission power to Western Australian households and businesses at the lowest sustainable cost, while allowing new technologies to connect and giving people more control over their electricity use. To support the transformation strategy, Western Power is proposing amendments to the technical rules. The technical rules are a set of technical requirements for planning, design, operation, and performance of the Southwest Interconnected System, or as we know it, the SWIS. They also provide performance and technical specification for user equipment connection to the network and facilitating the secure and reliable supply of power for customers in the SWIS. Western Power is responsible for the development and application of the technical rules, and the Economic Regulator Authority plays a key role in approving and publishing the technical rules. Since the technical rules commenced in July 2007, except for a mandatory review in 2011, changes and updates to the technical rules have been infrequent and relatively minor. A review of the technical rule began in January 2020. Western Power established a working group which included subject matter experts from Western Power, the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, Energy Policy WA, EPFA, and Western Power Consultants, GHD, and ERA as observers. By 30th of July 2021, Western Power will submit several proposed amendments to the ERA. The ERA will then review the amendments and establish a technical rules committee to assist with the review. The ERA will also conduct public consultation to provide feedback to Western Power for inclusion in resubmission if required. The ERA expected to make a decision by March 2022. Western Power acknowledges that the current technical rules are outdated and do not easily cater for emerging energy markets and customer needs. As part of the review process, we want our customers to have input into these proposed amendments to ensure that any changes to user obligations are fair and reasonable, fit for purpose, and meet their needs. Today's customer forum is designed to give the public an initial overview of the proposed changes and an opportunity to provide initial feedback prior to our submission date by 30th of July. The purpose of is to bring you, our respected customers, on the change journey, making sure that you have an awareness and understanding of the proposed changes, and most importantly, making sure that you have an opportunity to have your say. Again, thank you for attending today's session. We hope that you find it informative, and please ensure that get the most out of the QA session. And if you have any question, please share your questions and we will do our best to respond to them either today or get back to you. Again, thank you. And on that basis, I hand over to Dr. David Bones to walk you through the technical side of the technical rules. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm David Bones, and it's my pleasure to be with you today to step you through the bulk of the prepared presentation. As Zahir has already mentioned and Sabina's mentioned, the focus of today is really on the changes to the technical rules, and in particular, those changes that we believe are going to be most relevant for users who are developing large generating systems. So this slide just gives you an overview of the topics we're going to go through today. We'll start by providing just a little bit of a scene setter refresher, just to bring everyone up to speed with what we mean by the technical rules and what the current version of the technical rules look like. We'll then step in more detail, looking at the proposed changes. And we'll cover off, first of all, some of the changes that affect all users. And then specifically, we'll spend the bulk of the presentation today looking at those changes that are most relevant and apply to large generating systems. We'll also touch on load requirements. And because there have been some changes around commissioning and compliance arrangements that particularly impact large generators, we'll also cover those off today. So the aim of today is not to go through a clause by clause, sentence by sentence redrafting of the technical rules, but rather to introduce the rationale for the change and to describe the change at a reasonably high level. And that is really to facilitate users understanding the nature of those changes and being able to participate in the process moving forward and provide feedback. We do invite you as you go during the day, as Sabina noted, just use the chat session to drop in any questions you might have, and the moderators from Western Power will be monitoring those chats as we go. We'll break at a couple of points through the presentation just to see if there's any questions we need to respond to, but in some instances I fully anticipate that the team from Western Power will be able to respond to some of the questions on the fly, if you like. Alrighty, so let's get into it. I'm going to start with just an overview of the technical rules, as we mentioned, and this is really just to bring everyone up to speed. Now, I think Zahir has done a pretty good job of laying the framework for what the technical rules are. So just reiterating, it's a regulatory instrument given force through the access code. And importantly, the technical rules define the standards for planning, design and operation of the South West Interconnected System. So they're a fairly important document. In addition, they define the planning requirements. They define arrangements for coordination of operational matters. And specifically for this forum today, they specify the technical requirements that users who are wanting to connect to the Western Power network must meet. So you can see that they have quite a significant impact. Western Power is expected to operate their network and to manage investments to the network to ensure that the requirements in the technical rules can be met, and equally well, the requirements in the technical rules can impact the design of user facilities. So it's a fairly wide reaching instrument that has implications for both users, networks, and AEMO as the system operator in terms of how the network operates and the capability that's provided in the transmission system. In terms of the structure of the technical rules, so the technical rules has 5 key chapters, which are highlighted on this slide. You can see 4 of them are highlighted in amber, and the last one, chapter 5, is in grey. The reason we've done that is just to signify that where we've got to with the review so far is we've made good progress through chapters 2, 3 and 4, and to the point where we're able to hold these forums this week to brief people on the key changes. Chapter 5 is still a little bit more of a work in progress, but outcomes from the review of chapter 5 will be wrapped up by the end of July in time for submission to the ERA. So just stepping through then in what's in each chapter. So chapter 1 provides general information, including the scope and application of the technical rules. It talks about the obligations of various parties and contains a number of administrative matters, things like dealing with legacy plant and equipment and legacy arrangements. Chapter 2 is where you'll find the power system performance standards. Included within chapter 2 then is also the obligations that the network service provider must meet in trying to deliver those power system performance standards. In keeping with that, chapter 2 also defines the network planning criteria that the network service provider must follow, and provides some design requirements as well for the network. We then step to chapter 3, which is one of the chapters we'll spend a fair bit of time on today, and it contains the technical requirements for user facilities. Chapter 4 discusses the arrangements and the framework for inspections, testing and commissioning of user facilities, and importantly, the arrangements for demonstrating compliance with the technical requirements. And chapter 5 is really focused more on operational matters, and it's those matters that are largely in the domain of coordinating activities between the network operator, being Western Power, and the market operator market and system operator being AEMO. So we'll now step into the next section, which just is to provide a bit more background on the review that has just been undertaken. I'll start off with just going through some of the key factors that Western Power has identified as being critical to producing well-rounded and appropriate revisions to the technical rules. So first of all, we recognise that there were some shortfalls in the existing drafting, and that needed to be addressed through the review. But in undertaking the review, we adopted these success factors, if you like, as guiding what would be a successful outcome. So we thought success would be if the technical rules specified performance requirements that was sufficient to ensure that customers continued to receive a reliable and secure power supply. We thought that it was also important that the technical rules are able to accommodate the changing nature of the power system. And as Zahira spoke to, that's largely being driven by moves to decarbonise the power system, and also a greater proliferation of embedded energy resources. The technical rules should provide for that cost-effective development of decentralised power supplies. And what that means is we need to accommodate those newer technologies, including disconnected microgrids and standalone power systems. The technical rules need to encourage the efficient development of the transmission distribution network, and that's achieved by having appropriate planning criteria. The technical rules shouldn't be biased towards any particular technology and should seek to accommodate new and emerging technologies like battery energy storage systems and inverter connected generating systems. And last, but by no means unimportantly, the technical rules and revisions need to consider the feedback that's been provided effectively through the number of exemptions that have been necessary for some of the provisions in the existing rules. So by looking back over those exemptions and understanding the basis for granting those exemptions, we've been able to identify appropriate modifications to the rules, which we hope will reduce the requirement for exemptions moving forward. Last but not least, the review of the technical rules is not happening in isolation. In fact, there's wider reviews, WEM reviews underway that are running in parallel with the review of the technical rules. And so it's important that what we come up with as revised technical rules makes sense in terms of the broader WEM reforms. And so that's been a key area of focus for us. As Zahira identified, it's been a long while since there'd been a comprehensive cover-to-cover review of the technical rules. So many would argue it's very timely to undertake this now. We see it as being also very important for providing a robust version of the technical rules, which then provides a starting point for the new technical rules governance regime, which will allow anyone to propose changes moving forward. So this is really one of the motivations at the moment, is to produce that robust revised set of rules that will be a good starting point for that new process. As Zahira mentioned, we need to recognise various drivers for change, including the changing characteristics of the power supply network. And as I spoke to previously, recognising the broader reviews that are underway. We've captured through the technical rules some of the issues that have arisen through the actual application of the current rules. And that means addressing those legacy issues and any of the problems that have given rise to the need for exemptions. And largely that's been around clarifying interpretations and drafting. This has not been a trivial process by any stretch of the imagination. GHD has been working with Western Power now for a number of years in doing work related to the revision of the technical rules. And we've done 3 phases of work. The first stage was really the work we did to look at the need for changes to the technical requirements for larger generating systems. That initial piece of work then led into the development of the generator performance standards framework, which has now been implemented within the WEM rules. In stage 2, we focused on chapters 1 through 4 of the technical rules and sought about undertaking a comprehensive review of those chapters. And more recently, we've extended the work to also include chapter 5 of the technical rules. And in that way, it will be a cover-to-cover robust review that's submitted through to the ERA at the end of July to allow then the ERA to consider those proposed revisions. And hopefully we get into a position whereby after March of 2022, we'll see the new technical rules come into force. So what I'm going to do now is just to introduce some of the changes at a high level that we've looked at across all of chapter 3. So that's for all users. Once we've stepped through some of those, we'll just pause for a few questions, and then we'll step into, after the questions, some more detail about the specific requirements for large generating systems. So just to highlight some of the key drivers for change, particularly around the user requirements. And so this is just jumping a little bit deeper than those broader high level requirements we spoke of previously. So a lot of the motivation for tweaking and adjusting the user requirements really harks back to that overarching provision of trying to make sure that the technical rules provide adequate definition of technical requirements so that there's no degradation in system security or reliability over time. And so what that underneath that banner, then we identified several things that needed to be addressed. One was that the technical rules as they're currently structured, there'd been bits and pieces added over time for additional technologies, and it was all becoming a little bit hard to know exactly which sections applied for which classes of user equipment wanted to be connected. So one of the things we identified as being a value add was to include some forward organisation, some mapping, which would allow users to better identify which requirements really applied to their particular facility. As we spoke of, the process has now gone through the WEM review process and ended up with revisions to the generator performance standard framework. And so now you have within the WEM rules the requirement for large generating systems that are transmission connected and participating in the market to develop performance standards through the WEM rules process. Putting that framework in place was really driven by a need to make sure that those large generators have appropriate technical requirements, again, to provide appropriate system security outcomes. So there was a need when we go through the revisions for the technical rules to make sure that when we're considering large generators and we're making sure that they have similar technical requirements, be they negotiating those requirements through the process in the technical rules or the process in the WEM rules. We wanted to make sure that we were getting a consistent approach and consistent outcomes. I'll just note that as we go through the slides today, you'll see descriptions of what that framework looks like. All of those descriptions are based on making sure we're aligned with what's in the WEM rules as they currently stand. And we would just note that what this means moving forward is we need to keep tight alignment between those generator performance standards framework in the WEM rules and the large generating unit technical requirements that are specified in the technical rules. Some of the other things that we've adjusted is we've made sure that there aren't any gaps in the way different technologies can be addressed. Some of the previous drafting was more focused on, say, synchronous generation technologies. So we've tried to adopt drafting that can be applied to different forms of generation technology. We've tried to make sure that the technical requirements and the compliance regimes are appropriate for the security risk inherent with the size of the particular generating systems. So what that meant when we looked at that was we formed the view that it was appropriate to have a different level of sophistication and complexity at play for large generating systems, say compared to small embedded power systems that might be sitting on people's rooftops in the form of rooftop PV. And the last thing we wanted to do was to see if we could simplify the drafting of the technical requirements for LV connected inverter-based systems by leveraging the new inverter standard AS4777. And we've largely been able to do that. That leads to simplified drafting in the technical rules, and it also reduces the risk that you could get the technical rules conflicting or being somewhat interpreted as being contradictory compared to the Australian standards. That makes it easier for users. It means that they simply need to comply with the Australian standard. The other things that we've looked at is really trying, as I said before, to be as clear as possible with the requirements, to try and reduce the need for exemptions moving forward. And we'll see that part of the performance standards framework that's been introduced for large generators does act to achieve that. We've clarified the requirements around remote control and monitoring, largely trying to be consistent there with contemporary practice. And we've simplified the way the protection requirements for user facilities are expressed. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail on a subsequent slide. So let's just have a look at the structural changes. So this slide shows the various sections that are now within Chapter 3 of the technical rules following the revisions. It's somewhat similar to the structure that exists at the moment, but we have made some subtle changes to the focus of each of the subsections. So we've still got section 3.1, which provides introductory information. That section has been enhanced to also include some navigation aids so that users are more easily able to identify which particular technical requirements apply to their facilities. And I'll give you an example of those in a moment. We then step in section 3.2, specifies the requirements that are common to all users. 3.3, which we'll spend a fair bit of time discussing today, presents the requirements for large generating systems. And those requirements apply to large generating systems, whether they're transmission connected or distribution connected. And by large generating systems, we're really meaning generating systems that have an aggregate capacity of 5 MVA or greater. Sorry, or greater than 5 MVA. We then in section 3.4 talk about the connection requirements for loads. And 3.5, we've drawn together all of the protection requirements into one place. And you'll see within 3.5, there's some subsections separating out different arrangements for different users. I'll go into that on the subsequent slides. And then the last 3 sections present information for this connection of smaller generating systems and the technical requirements they need to meet. We've separated them out so that you can clearly see which set of requirements apply in particular situations. So 3.6 applies if your small generating system is transmission connected or connected to the high voltage distribution system. 3.7 covers off those requirements for small generating systems connected to the low voltage distribution system, with the exception of inverter energy systems that are connected to the low voltage distribution system via a standard connection service. And the technical requirements for those facilities are specified in 3.8. I mentioned that we've done a bit of work in 3.1 to try and provide a better way of mapping the requirements for users. This slide is one of the tables that we've introduced into section 3.1. So we've introduced this table, which talks about the technical requirements that user facilities need to meet if you're connected to the transmission network. And on the next slide, we'll see there's a similar table which presents the technical requirements for user facilities connected to the distribution network. So the intent here is, as a user developing a facility that wants to connect to the Western Power Network, first of all, if you know whether you're going to be transmission or distribution connected, you can go to the appropriate table, and then from there, you can identify which of the sections in the technical rules are intended to apply to your facility. So you can see we've structured the table to separate out load requirements, requirements that apply to electricity storage when acting as a load, i.e. consuming active power, requirements for storage when acting as a generator and producing active power, and requirements that apply to generating systems. At a transmission level, those generation requirements are further subdivided based on the installed capacity and those that are greater than 5 MVA we're classifying as large generating systems. And you can see that they're the ones where you then need to find the specific requirements in section 3.3. And for the smaller generating systems, the requirements are specified in section 3.6. 3.5 is the protection requirements, 3.2 the common requirements, and 3.1 the introductory section. So just jumping forward to the next slide, you'll see on this slide that it presents similar information, but at a distribution level. So this is for facilities connecting into the distribution network. The first thing you notice is there's more rows on this slide. And that's simply because there's a few more variations that needed to be considered when you're talking distribution connected facilities. So you've got the consideration both of the size of the generating system and on the voltage and the connection arrangements that apply. So whether you're connecting to the LV via a non-standard connection service or a standard connection service, and if you're connecting to the high voltage, then differentiated by the size of the connection. So we've separated out each of these. We believe that across these tables, then a user would be able to say, well, what facility am I looking to connect and which requirements need to apply? One of the questions we often get is, well, what if my facility includes a combination of devices? So you might have a load facility that's also going to have some generation connected as part of that same facility. And so the answer there is, well, you take the load component, and the load component needs to meet the requirements for loads, and the generation component needs to meet the requirements for generation. And so you can look then through these tables and work out which requirements apply to your facility. I mentioned previously that we've also made some changes to the protection section, so section 3.5. What we found was in the existing technical rules, the protection requirements were a little bit scattered across chapter 3. We thought it was appropriate to try and bring them all together in one place. That way users know where to look when they're trying to get a consolidated view of the protection requirements that their facility needs to meet. So within chapter section 3.5, there's subsections that present common protection requirements, and then additional sections that go in and specify the requirements that are specific to loads, protection requirements specific to transmission connected generators, and requirements that are specific to distribution connected generators. And we also have a section there that talks to the protection required for small generators connected to the LV network via standard connections. So you can see then it's a fairly simple way to navigate and identify which requirements actually apply to any given user facility. All right, so that gets us through the first sort of introductory steps around what changes are proposed for the user requirements and some of the background material for the technical rules. What I might do at that point in time is just pause and reach out to our moderating team and see if there's any questions that have come in that we need to discuss before we head into the more detailed discussion of the large generating requirements.
Hi, David. Yes, there was one question. We've answered that. There isn't any other questions for you to answer at this stage, so I think you can carry on.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Savannah. So what we're going to do now, and this next session is going to present quite a lot of detail as we step through the technical requirements for large generators. What we're going to do is step through all of those requirements in one hit. So I'll be talking for a little while. We will get to the end and then pause and hopefully have some good time at the end for any questions and discussions of questions if they arise. But I encourage you as you're going, if something hits you as a question on a particular slide, continue to drop it into the chat room and our moderators will see if they can address it as we go. So when we look at specifically the large generating system technical requirements, some of the key things we wanted to keep in mind when we were making these changes, in addition to the mapping improvement that we've spoken of just previously, was really we wanted to be pay careful attention to the need to not create a misalignment between the provisions in the technical rules and those that might apply in the WEM rules. So what we were trying to protect against here is, say, if you've got a large generating system that's coming through and seeking to make a connection with Western Power, but isn't going to participate in a WEM. And so then it would be faced with needing to meet the technical requirements as defined in the technical rules and wouldn't be subject to the generator performance standards in the WEM rules. What we wanted to avoid is that for that same size generator connecting at the same point in the network, if it had instead been elected to participate in the WEM rules, so it's transmission connected, and then it went through and needed to develop performance standards through the WEM rules process, that you would actually end up with different technical requirements for that same generator. And we thought that wouldn't make much sense, because the size of the generator and where and how it's connected is probably dictating, and the generation technology dictating the system security risk that the generator poses. So they should be treated equivalently. So we have spent a fair bit of time trying to make sure that what we're doing in the technical rules now aligns. So what you should find is that if you're a large generating system, you'll end up with the set of performance standards, and they will either be developed through the process in the WEM rules or through the process as defined in the technical rules. And we'll step through that on the subsequent slides. The other things that we had front of mind when we were going through was to be cognizant of any previous exemptions that have been granted or requested by large generators, and seeking to make sure that the new framework, where appropriate, addresses those exemption requirements, hopefully reducing the need for exemptions into the future. And we've adjusted the remote monitoring control arrangements, the protection arrangements, and provided better guidance around the requirements for the provision of power system models. So what do we mean by generator performance standards? So I imagine that many on the call today have some familiarity with the performance standard framework that's been introduced into the WEM rules. So what we're proposing to introduce into the technical rules is a very similar framework, and this will apply for all large generators greater than 5 MVA, and it will apply for those generators who haven't negotiated performance standards through the process in the WEM rules. So that could cover all generators, for instance, large generators that are distribution connected, and those that are not, participating in the WEM. So what are the generator performance standards? So if you think about it, the generator performance standard framework describes a negotiation range. So for each one of 11 technical requirements, there's a need to negotiate what's called a generator performance standard, which defines the agreed level of performance that the generating system needs to achieve. Now that agreed level of performance is what we call a negotiated standard, and it needs to be set so that it is between what's termed an ideal standard and a minimum standard. So the ideal standard, it represents a level of performance that if you reach that level of performance, then the network service provider would not be entitled to refuse connection on the basis of your ability to deliver that particular technical requirement. So that's a condition that's going to be sufficient under all conditions for connection with respect to that technical requirement. The minimum standard, on the other hand, represents a level of performance that might be appropriate in some, but not necessarily all circumstances. So you could imagine what might be appropriate for connection in one particular part of the network, or with one particular technology may not necessarily be appropriate everywhere. The framework requires that the generators seek to establish a performance standard as close as practicable to the ideal standard. And there's some quite detailed framework criteria that you need to meet to be able to justify being granted a negotiated performance standard at a level lower than the ideal. And that framework is now introduced into the technical rules, again, very similar to the equivalent framework that exists within the WEM rules. The other elements that make up the generator performance standard framework is the negotiation criteria and the common requirements. So just to bring everyone up to speed on what we mean by that. So common requirements need to be met regardless of the level of performance articulated in your negotiated standard. And you'll see when we step through each of the 11 requirements on the subsequent slides, what's meant by a common requirement. And then there's a negotiation criteria. So there's a framework for negotiating the negotiated standard, but then for some specific technical requirements, there's additional guidance given as to factors that need to be considered through the negotiation process. So through that process, all large generators should eventually end up with a generator performance standard. The other aspect that was introduced into the WEM rules in concert with the GPS provisions were provisions around relevant modifications. So what we mean by relevant modifications, that's a modification to a large generating system that has the potential to affect the ability of the generating system to meet its performance standard, or affects the characteristics of the generating system that are important for meeting the technical requirements covered by the generating performance standard. So it's important that those modifications are assessed to identify whether there is any need to renegotiate any aspect of the generator performance standard, whether there's any need to redefine generator compliance arrangements, and in particular, often if it is a relevant modification, there will be a need for, once the modification's been made, some additional tests, commissioning tests and validation tests to confirm that after the relevant modification, the generator is meeting its generator performance standards. So what we're going to do on the next slides is to consider each of the technical requirements covered by generating performance standards. So you can see on this slide, all of them are listed there as dot points. For each one of those, the mental image to take forward into the discussion is the framework generally is talking about an ideal and a minimum standard and the ability to negotiate a point somewhere between the two. For some technical requirements, the ideal and minimum are actually set at the same point, which means it's just a point standard. But in general, for most of those technical requirements, there is an ideal, there is a minimum, which means there is some negotiation range. The introduction of that negotiation range, we believe, is going to be quite useful in terms of avoiding the need for potential exemptions into the future, because it does allow for this negotiation. And often what you'll find is the minimum standard where it's been set, it has been set at a level informed by some of the applications that Western Power's previously received for exemptions from technical performance criteria as currently stated in the technical rules. So you see it's opening up this range for negotiation. So let's get started on the first of the requirements, which is the active power capability. So the active power capability generator performance standard defines the requirement for the generating system to be able to deliver its rated active power output under all conditions. The GPS provides clarity around what's meant by all conditions. And there's a requirement that the GPS include information about any reduction in active power capability with ambient temperature. Further, that the GPS requires that the rated maximum output capability needs to be able to be specified at the generator terminal levels for synchronous generating units or at the connection point for other generating systems. Having specified that maximum output, maximum rated power output, then the generating system needs to be able to achieve that at any temperature up to a maximum ambient temperature nominated by the network service provider, except under certain circumstances. And they include where the NSP has agreed that the generating system should be allowed to reduce its active power output to achieve required reactive power capability, particularly under maximum ambient conditions. So what does that mouthful mean? It means, if you like, that if you've got, say, an inverter connected system, you might negotiate with Western Power to say, hey, I want to be able to, under very hot days, pull back the active power production to ensure that I can provide the full reactive power range under conditions where Western Power actually requires that reactive power range to control the voltage of the power system. This is an example of one of the standards where the ideal and minimum are aligned. If we go on to the next one, we're covering off the reactive power capability. And you see as we're going through, each of these technical requirements is a different, talking to a different aspect of technical performance for the generating system. So the reactive power capability for the large generating system is defined on this slide. It's defined with respect to an ideal and a minimum performance level. We've tried to highlight the differences between the ideal and the minimum with the top diagram on this slide, which shows your typical generator capability curve, a fairly idealized one with the apparent power shown in the pink curve. And then what we're saying is for a stated maximum power output, you have to be able to achieve a given level of reactive power absorption or production, and to be able to sustain that level of reactive power absorption or production at any point down to the minimum active power output. The difference between then the ideal and minimum standard primarily relates to how much reactive power needs to be produced. And you can see the dark red vertical bars are identifying the ideal standard, and the lighter red shaded area on the diagram identifying the minimum standard. The ideal standard then requires a reactive power output equal to 0.484 times the rated maximum active power. The minimum, it's 0.329 times the rated maximum active power. And respectively, they're equivalent to achieving a 0.9 and 0.95 power factor at the rated maximum active power output. So if you're meeting the ideal standard, you need to be able to deliver that reactive power output for any voltage within the range specified in the system standards. The minimum standard, on the other hand, allows for some relaxation of the requirement at different voltage levels. And that's indicated, that relaxation, by the diagram that we've got on the bottom of the page. So what we're saying there is, in particular, we're comfortable relaxing the requirement if the requirement would not be of particular benefit to the power system. So what are we talking about there? So if you think of a power system where the voltage is between 1 per unit and 1.1 per unit, so you've got high voltages. Under those conditions, you really want to be able to access the ability to absorb reactive power and to be able to control those over voltages. Being able to produce reactive power at that location under those conditions is not something that is probably going to be required. And so there's that relaxation. Equally well, if you're looking at a condition where you've got low voltage on the network, well, under those conditions, you want to be able to maximise the reactive power production capability. And so the trade-off between those points is then indicated by the blue trapezium on the bottom diagram. And so it allows that relaxation to be specified as part of the generating performance standard. And the last thing that the minimum standard allows is for non-scheduled generating systems to be able to reduce their active power output to achieve the required reactive power capability. It's, if you like, stepping down that capability curve to be able to improve the ability to meet the stated reactive power requirement. So in general, the range that's covered here by the ideal and minimum standards represent the range that's typically been considered by exemption requests that have come into Western Power. So we think that having this negotiated range available should reduce the need for exemptions in the future, because it should be possible for negotiation of an appropriate generator performance standard. And again, each of those requirements are the ones we've expressed and will continue to express today are equivalent to those that are defined in the current version of the WEM rules. So the next technical requirement is the requirement to provide control over voltage and reactive power. If you're meeting the ideal performance standard, then your large generating system must be able to regulate any of voltage, reactive power or power factor, and to be able to switch between those control modes as required by the NSP. Furthermore, you have to meet regulation requirements. So you need to be able to regulate voltage to within 0.5% of a nominated set point, or reactive power or power factor to 2% of the nameplate rating. You also need to make sure that your control systems are operating stably in all control modes. And depending on the technology employed, you'll need to meet certain performance requirements. So the requirements there for synchronous generating systems are your typical excitation system performance requirements. So ceiling voltages, rise times, settling times and the like, and the need for a power system stabilizer. The requirements for asynchronous generating units have been expressed more in terms of what you expect as control system parameters. So minimum gains, rise times, settling times, and the need for a power oscillation damper to be fitted. So that's then the requirements for your large generating system to meet the ideal standards. The minimum standards is expressed in a similar way, but what you'll see is that the requirements are relaxed in a particular fashion. So instead of the requirement to be able to regulate voltage, reactive power and power factor with the choice as to which mode you're in being made by the NSP, when you're operating to the minimum standard, you're able to choose one of those quantities to control. when you're controlling one of those quantities, regulating one of those quantities, you still have to be able to operate stably and have a stable control system. The regulation range and the performance is reduced a bit compared to the ideal standard. So you're required to achieve 2% of the set point for voltage control and 5% of nameplate rating for power factor or reactive power. And again, there's the requirements for technology-specific measures around the controls performance. So excitation system requirements for generating systems and control system requirements for asynchronous generating systems like inverter-connected solar farms. And this is an example of a standard where there is also a negotiated standard. So in this one, you're expected to achieve the performance which is possible through optimizing controls and, where practicable, installing additional dynamic reactive power equipment. You'll see that on this slide, we've got elements of both the ideal and minimum standard expressed differently depending on the technology. If you've got a generating system that's a combination of both synchronous and asynchronous generating systems, then the rule of thumb is really the synchronous part needs to meet the requirements for synchronous generating systems, and the asynchronous part needs to meet the requirements for the asynchronous generating systems. And as a whole, the common requirements need to be met. So we'll just move on to the next one, which is active power control capability. So again, this is one that has a common requirement, ideal and minimum standards. So to meet the ideal standards for active power control, a large generating system that is scheduled must be able to follow dispatch instructions that are issued by AEMO or the NSP, ramp linearly between dispatch targets, and achieve a minimum rate of change of 5% of rated active power per minute. Non-scheduled generators meeting the ideal standard must, subject to energy source availability, not exceed a rate of change of greater than 10 megawatts a minute or 15% of the nameplate rating per minute. To meet the minimum standard for active power control, a large generating system that's scheduled must simply be able to follow dispatch instructions issued by AEMO or the NSP, so the requirement for linear ramping has been dropped. And non-scheduled generators meeting the minimum standard must, subject to energy source availability, not exceed a rate of change that's been agreed with AEMO and the network service provider. And in addition, you can see there's some common requirements. So that's being capable of meeting WEM dispatch requirements. So that's having the facilities in place to be able to do that. And for the GPS to actually record any settings that might limit the active power control capability. And a common requirement that appears for many of these technical requirements is for the controls to provide adequate damping. You'll see when we step through this one, we introduce the phrase subject to energy source availability. This has been introduced a lot across many of the technical requirements, and it's a way of making the requirements able to be applied to both traditional synchronous generators and to renewable generating systems. So what it means is a renewable generating system is probably not able to control the amount of energy that's available to it at any given point in time. For instance, it's normally the case that your solar farms will seek to be operating to produce an amount of power compatible with the amount of daylight falling on the solar farm. If that amount of daylight changes, then so does the output of the solar farm. It means that there isn't any way for that those energy source limitations then need to be recognised in setting the technical requirements. And in many of the requirements, there's in effect a relaxation if the deviation from the requirement is due to a deviation or a change in the energy source availability. So that's what we mean when we see that phrase, and you'll see it used a lot through the discussion today. The next technical requirement relates to inertia and frequency control. So this is pretty important, particularly for an isolated power station such as this Southwest Interconnected System, where you want to maintain good control of frequency and frequency stability. And to do that, that's optimally achieved if you've got all generators that can provide a level of primary frequency response actually providing that primary frequency response. And that's what this requirement seeks to achieve. So all large generating systems meeting the ideal performance standard must, subject to energy source availability, be able to automatically respond to correct frequency deviations with the response achieved having a better than 25 millihertz deadband and a droop that's 4% or better, provided that response wouldn't drive you below any technical minimums. In addition, if you're meeting the ideal standard, you need to be able to achieve a 10% increase in output in response to a frequency reduction and a 30% reduction in response to a frequency increase. And importantly, those responses need to be sustained. For scheduled generators, you want to achieve 90% of the maximum response within 6 seconds and sustain it for 10. For non-scheduled generators, it's achieving 90% of the maximum response in a shorter period of time, that's 2 seconds, and sustain for 10 seconds. When we then look at the minimum performance standards, they're somewhat similar, but offer relaxations. So again, it's subject to energy source availability. You need to be able to respond to correct frequency deviations and to have a 25 millihertz deadband and a response consistent with a 4% droop. And that's provided that at the time the disturbance arose, you were operating below 85% of your rated output and that the response didn't drive you below technical minimums. The GPS requires that, although you don't have to meet that particular 4% droop requirement above 85% output, that the capability to respond above 85% output is actually recorded in your performance standard. And additionally, there's also requirements about achieving a 10% increase in output in response to frequency reduction and a 30% reduction in response to a frequency increase, and for that to be sustained for 10 seconds. So that requirement's somewhat similar. What's been relaxed is the speed with which you have to get to those response levels. There's common requirements for this one as well. And there's also a set of negotiating criteria as shown on the slide. So the main aspect of the common requirements are to install appropriate monitoring and recording equipment to be able to demonstrate that you're meeting the requirements of your performance standard after an event. And importantly, that the GPS must record any relevant disconnect settings or protection settings, and that all controls providing the frequency response are adequately damped. The next series of slides we're going to look at discuss 5 performance standards that all place obligations on generating systems to ride through disturbances Collectively, they each consider a different characteristic and the ability of the generating system to ride through that particular characteristic. So the first one we'll be looking at is the frequency ride-through, frequency disturbance ride-through performance requirement. And it really looks at the ability of the generating system to ride through disturbances that have a particular magnitude and duration of frequency being away from 50 hertz and a rate of change of frequency within particular limits. We'll then have a look at the other set, which cover off the magnitude and duration of voltage disturbances, and then the number and type of disturbances occurring in close succession. We'll also consider the partial load rejection performance standard and the performance standard that discusses the requirement to be able to avoid disconnection if there's deviations in the quality of supply. So jumping back to the frequency ride-through requirement, it's illustrated on this slide. You can see the ideal standard illustrated by the diagram on the left and the minimum standard illustrated by the diagram on the right. The way to interpret these standards is you need to remain in operation, providing the frequency remains within the white area shown on these diagrams. If the frequency was to deviate into the grey area, then that's permissible for that the generator may disconnect under those conditions. And you can see there's some quite wide frequency deviations characterised there by the ideal and a slightly narrower set of frequency deviations for the minimum. The ideal requires the generating system be able to survive and continue to operate for a greater rate of change of frequency than the minimum. So at the ideal level, you're talking about up to 4 hertz a second over the first 200 milliseconds following the disturbance, and the minimum is half that at 2 hertz a second over the first 250 milliseconds. The common requirements that are specified require the GPS to record any relevant frequency trip settings. So it's obviously quite important if you're saying that you're going to be able to avoid tripping at a particular frequency to actually then record the settings, the frequency settings at which you are programmed to disconnect. And the negotiation criteria, so guidance is given there that the NSP must consider whether it's the frequency is likely to fall below 48.5 when it's considering whether to accept the relaxed standards specified by the minimum performance standard. So as I said, the next disturbance ride-through requirement relates to the size and duration of voltage disturbances. Again, we've got two charts on the screen illustrating the ideal on the left and the minimum on the right. You'll see on the two charts there's full red lines and dotted red lines, with the dotted red line appearing for the under voltage region. So the full red line refers to in the over voltage region the requirement of both the transmission distribution level, and for the under voltage region, if you're distribution connected, then it's the dashed line that you need to adhere to. If you're transmission connected, it's a full red line. The other differences then that come into the minimum standard is that the network service provider may agree to additional relaxation about the duration of time at which you need to survive a zero voltage level, provided that that time duration doesn't exceed the maximum fault clearance time with no circuit breaker fail. And in addition, the minimum standard says that you need to record any operational requirements that are in place to allow the performance standard to be met. The common requirement, very similar to the one for frequency ride-through, is that any voltage trip settings need to be recorded in the generator performance standards. So we'll now, in the next couple of slides, consider the multiple disturbance ride-through requirement. This is a fairly complex requirement, and it is a new addition to the technical rules. So the multiple disturbance ride-through requirement came out of recognition of the need to consider the ability of large generating systems to survive and to ride through faults in close succession. And that was identified through investigations following the South Australian blackout in 2016. Post-event analysis of that blackout revealed that a number of the wind farms in South Australia had disconnected or substantially reduced their output following a number of faults in fairly close succession. The response to those faults had not been captured by their existing generator performance standards, and largely came as a bit of a surprise to the system operator, and so they hadn't secured the power system in recognition that disconnection could actually occur. So as part of the post-event analysis, attention was turned to the question of whether or not performance standards should actually specify a requirement to be able to ride through a number of faults in succession, and whether, if that was the case, then how should that criteria actually be specified. And so a fair amount of work went on, and a multiple disturbance ride-through criteria was developed and implemented within the national electricity rules on the east coast of Australia. And we've, in developing the requirements that now exist within the WEM rules and proposed to go into the technical rules, we've drawn heavily on that learning from the east coast. So this first slide presents the common requirements that exist for the multiple disturbance ride-through GPS. I'll step through those, and then we'll look at the ideal and minimum requirements. So the common requirements have to be met regardless of whether you've negotiated a level of performance at the ideal, the minimum, or somewhere in between. And you can see from this slide that some of those common requirements are the same regardless of the generation technology deployed, while others are somewhat tailored to the specific generation technology. So the ones that are common include the need to record in your generator performance standards all relevant disconnection settings. And so that was one of the, if you think back to the South Australian blackout, one of the things that caught them out was this lack of capturing of the actual protection settings that cause a disconnection. So there's a requirement to make sure they're captured. There's also a need to record in the GPS any operational arrangements that apply under abnormal operating conditions. And if you're thinking, multiple faults in close succession, you may well be getting into some level of abnormal operation. And the other thing that the common requirements specify is that a fault that occurs as a consequence of a reclosure event should be counted as one of the successive faults that you have to ride through. So when we're saying under the ideal and minimum standards that you have to ride through a certain number of faults in succession in a certain period of time, that number of faults needs to include any faults re-established through a reclose operation. And then we separate into requirements that differ by whether you're talking about synchronous generating systems or asynchronous generating systems. So for synchronous generating systems, there's a requirement around the maximum reactive current contribution that could be required by the generating system to support voltages during the faults. And there's a recognition that the NSP may agree that the reactive current contribution can be measured at a location other than the connection point. While for asynchronous generating systems, again, there's a limit on the reactive current contribution. The reactive current contribution for asynchronous systems is lower than specified for synchronous systems. And there's recognition again of the ability to vary where the reactive current contribution is measured through agreement with the NSP. And the reactive current contribution, there's recognition of different ways in which it may be calculated with reference to using either phase to phase, phase to ground, or sequence components of voltage. Again, provided that's been agreed with the NSP. And lastly but not leastly, there's a requirement that the GPS record all of those conditions under which the reactive current contribution needs to be provided from asynchronous generating systems. And so that might mean that if there's any particular need for the reactive current contribution to diminish under particular ambient conditions, then that would need to be captured and recorded in the generator performance standard. We'll now move on and just have a look at the minimum. So what we were looking at there were the common provisions that apply in all cases. You'll see that for both the ideal and minimum standards, there's a requirement at the top which talks about the types of faults and the number of those faults in a period of time that need to be ridden through, or in the terminology adopted in the technical rules, for the generating system to remain in continuous uninterrupted operation. And then in the bottom half of the table, again separated by technologies, is a discussion around the level of reactive current injection that needs to be provided both during the fault and after the fault is cleared to support the control and recovery of power system voltage. So just stepping through that in a little bit more detail, for the ideal standard, as you can see, there's a series of, if you like, eligible faults. So credible contingency, three-phase transmission fault cleared in primary protection, two-phase to ground, phase to ground, phase to phase transmission faults, or three-phase distribution faults cleared in the longest time for the relevant breaker fail protection, or the greater of 450 milliseconds and the longest time for all relevant primary protection to clear the fault. And so the requirement is then for any combination of 15 of those disturbances occurring within a 5-minute period. So if that was to happen, your generating system, if it's meeting the ideal standard, will be able to maintain continuous uninterrupted operation. Furthermore, there's requirements specified in the bottom of the page talking about the amount of reactive current injection that needs to be provided during the fault and after the fault is cleared to recover voltage. And you can see here that we're talking about fairly significant amounts of reactive current contribution. So we're talking about 4% of the maximum current contribution for every 1% reduction in voltage. And a similar requirement there for asynchronous generating systems. The asynchronous generating system requirements also provides or specifies a requirement for inductive reactive current that would be provided to reduce voltages should they be too high. If we jump forward to the next slide, then what that does is uses the same sort of approach to describe the minimum standard. And you'll see once again, top of the page, there's a sequence of eligible faults and a requirement to ride through a number of those in a 5-minute period. The first thing that you'll notice is that the number of faults that you're required to ride through has been reduced from 15 to 6. So that's a reduction in the performance requirement. And the other thing is that the some of the faults that are included when considering the ideal standard aren't included in the list of eligible faults there for the minimum standard. So there's generally a less arduous set of fault conditions. In terms of the information at the bottom of the slide, we're really talking there about a different level or requirement for reactive current support during and after the fault clears to support voltage. So again, less onerous requirements than the ideal standard. And this is a requirement also that has a negotiation criteria. And the negotiation criteria here requires the network service provider and the generator to only accept a negotiated generating performance standard if that performance standard, if that level of performance would not cause other generating systems or loads to be more likely to trip. So the next one of the disturbance ride-through requirements talks about the ability to respond to a partial load rejection. The ideal standard that's proposed here is very similar to the partial load rejection requirements that exist in the existing technical rules, which also requires the ability to ride through a 30% partial load rejection. The minimum standard provides for a relaxed requirement, requiring you to ride through a 5% partial load rejection. So I think that's fairly straightforward, that requirement. And you can see there the difference between the ideal and minimum performance standard. The last of the disturbance ride-through requirements relates back to quality of supply. And what it's requiring is that generating systems do not disconnect, provided the voltage fluctuations, harmonic distortion and voltage imbalance remain within the limits specified in the power system performance standards defined in section 2.2 of the technical rules. So that means that there's a level of deviation in the quality of supply that might occur. And if that does occur and it's still within the limits set within section 2.2, then the generating system needs to remain in operation. For this standard, the ideal is set at the same point as the minimum. So it's what we sometimes refer to as a point standard. And while this specific ride-through requirement is not expressed in this particular way in the current technical rules, it is captured somewhat by a general obligation on all users to ensure their facilities are capable of operation within the system performance standards specified in section 2.2. So that's the existing rule in clause 321A of the technical rules. So what we're thinking is that the inclusion of this additional disturbance ride-through requirement provides a bit more clarity, but really doesn't add any additional burden on large generators beyond what they would have faced under the existing technical rules. The last of the technical requirements considers the quality of the voltage waveform that's being produced by the generating source. The ideal standard is consistent with the requirement in the current technical rules, but that requirement of the current technical rules was really only expressed for synchronous and induction generating units. So it was a little bit silent on what was required for inverter connected generating systems. The requirement's been re-expressed with reference to, in a way that makes it applicable now for all generating systems. And that's been achieved by tying the requirement to the allocated distortion levels that the network service provider has specified the generating system meet as through the process described in chapter 2 of the technical rules. The ideal and minimum are somewhat similar, the difference being that the minimum allows for those acceptable distortion levels to be set through a stage 3 evaluation process, which tends to give rise to more relaxed levels. And the condition is that if a generator is operating at that minimum or more relaxed level, that they've agreed to fund any future mitigation works that might be needed as a result of operating at that lower distortion level. Or it could be that they, and some of those mitigation works might actually be to invest to tighten the level of distortion they create at a time in the future when it is actually causing a problem for other network users. So that gets us to the end of the discussion around the actual technical requirements that are going to be embodied in the generator performance standard. So again, large generating systems are either going to end up with the generator performance standard because they've been through the process described in the WEM rules and negotiated an appropriate generator performance standard, or they've connected through the process in the technical rules and again have negotiated generator performance standard, and the framework for that negotiation and the technical requirements that they need to meet where the ideal and minimums have been set are quite equivalent whether you're going through the technical rules process or the WEM rules process. So we should end up in somewhat similar conditions. The next thing then is, well, what happens if at some time in the future that generating system, large generating system, the owner decides to modify the generator in some fashion. And what we have done now is we've introduced the relevant modification framework into the technical rules to cater for that scenario. So the relevant modification framework requires that prior to undertaking a potential relevant modification, the generator needs to advise the NSP of the intended modification. So what do we mean by a potential relevant modification? Well, that's any works that may materially change characteristics of the generating system and thereby its ability to meet its generating performance standard obligations or require amendments to the GPS or the connection agreement or requires amendment to the connection application. So examples of things that might be considered a relevant modification. If you're operating a synchronous generating system and you're making large-scale replacements of the excitation system, that could affect many of the clauses we've just discussed or the ability to comply with many of those clauses, and so would likely be deemed a relevant modification. Depending on the extent of, say, reworking control systems and retuning of control systems, that might also be a relevant modification. You might consider adding additional capacity to an existing generating system by adding a STATCOM, adding a BESS, or in the case of renewable generators, adding additional turbines or PV arrays. All of these things, you can see that they would change your ability to meet previously stated generator performance standards, and therefore are likely to be relevant modifications. On the other hand, things like a like-for-like replacement of something is not likely to trigger a relevant modification. Things like implementing a patch on some software to maintain cybersecurity is unlikely to be a relevant modification. But the rule is when there's a chance that it is a potential relevant modification, the generator should advise the NSP of the intended modification. And then there's a process defined in the technical rules that the NSP and the generator go through. Out of that process, the NSP will make an assessment as to whether the works actually should be classified as a relevant modification. If they make that assessment, they notify the generator. Once that assessment is made, then that places certain obligations on the generator that they need to meet before the relevant modification is undertaken. So if that's the case, they need to submit any proposed GPS modifications, any proposed modifications to the generator compliance monitoring program. Those modifications are then assessed in much the same way as you would assess, say, an application to create a generator performance standard in the first place. So you go through the same assessment process that's in the technical rules. And then out of that, you reach a stage where there's an agreement as to the new GPS and the new compliance monitoring framework. Depending on the significance of the change, the network service provider may choose to revoke your approval to operate and require instead that sufficient commissioning tests are undertaken to be able to demonstrate that the generator with the relevant modification in place is able to meet the required performance standards. And often to facilitate those tests will require then the process of granting an interim approval to operate. And then once the test is successfully undertaken, that then rolls over into a reinstatement of the approval to operate. Those approval to operate mechanisms are a new process that's been introduced through revisions to Chapter 4, and that's to be consistent with an equivalent framework that's been introduced through the revisions to the WEM rules. Okay, well, let's keep going. The next change of significance was around dynamic modelling provisions. So the technical rules have always required large generators to provide computer models, and generally those models have been required to meet the generator load and modelling guidelines prepared by Western Power. What we've done with the revisions to the technical rules is we've just made that very clear. And the expectation is then that those guidelines will specify the modelling requirements. They'll provide information on the timeframes that apply when you're providing the models and any updates to the models, with those guidelines being produced by Western Power and updated from time to time. It's important that the models provided accurately represent the performance of the generating system, and therefore we've clarified the requirement for the models to be validated through testing. And as a result of any information that comes to light through ongoing compliance. A key requirement then also is to consider the need to update the models following any relevant modifications that we discussed on the previous slide. So just moving on then. The last set of technical requirements specifically related to large generating systems deal with monitoring, control and communication requirements. Again, we've sought to align the requirements for large generators as expressed in the technical rules with those in the WEM rules. And we've removed from the technical rules a list of quantities that used to be there around the signals to be monitored and controlled. And instead, we've introduced a requirement for Western Power to produce a control and monitoring guideline. And that control and monitoring guideline will provide information, including the signals to be monitored and the applicable communication standard that needs to be adhered to for the communication systems that takes those control and monitoring signals from the generator back to the network service provider. Generally, the requirement is expressed such that all large generating systems must provide remote monitoring equipment to enable the real-time monitoring and performance of their facility by the network service provider and AEMO. Remote monitoring that complies with the control and monitoring guideline, and for that remote monitoring to be made available at all times, subject to outages that have been agreed with the NSP and AEMO. So what this is doing is just beefing up and making a bit clearer the exact requirements to ensure appropriate visibility and control of these large power systems. I'd now just like to step through the requirements that apply to loads. In general, there's been very few changes to the requirements, the user requirements for loads. A couple of the key changes are highlighted on this slide. So we've adjusted the drafting to make it clearer that there's an expectation that all loads should participate in helping to address under frequency events. So these are large under frequency events where you need automatic under frequency load shedding to help secure the power system and stop the collapse of frequency. We've clarified the standards that apply for any communications between large loads and the network service providers, and that's communications to support remote monitoring. And we've made it clear that the energy storage systems, such as battery energy storage systems, when they're charging, must comply with the load requirements. So as I said, not that extensive a change. I'd now just like to touch on the changes we've made to inspection, testing and disconnection arrangements, or Chapter 4 of the technical rules. And we've touched on a few of these previously. Most of the, sorry, I'll just go back a slide. Most of the changes are highlighted on this slide. So the things we wanted to be very careful of when we were looking at changes to this area is we wanted to make sure that we're introducing proportionate compliance arrangements. So what does that mean? That means that we wanted to balance the benefit that you might get in terms of system security from a more onerous compliance regime against the cost of implementing that regime. And so what that meant is when we considered it, we looked at the size of the generating system as being something that provided an indication of the potential impact the generating system could have on system security. And as we mentioned previously, we came to the view that it was appropriate then to have a different approach for small generators compared to large generators. So the approach we've landed on is for all users, there needs to be appropriate upfront commissioning of their facilities. And as part of that commissioning will include demonstration of being able to meet the relevant technical performance requirements. For large generators, there's a need to implement an ongoing compliance monitoring program are very similar then in the way that's implemented to what's described in the WEM rules for large transmission connected market generators. And there's a need to reconsider that compliance assessment following any relevant modifications. So we're achieving through that the consistency with the WEM rules. The other things that we've done and we noted we needed to do when we revised Chapter 4 is to make some adjustments to the clauses pertaining to providing information about user facilities and the clauses around testing and inspection, and to provide a bit more clarity around some of the commissioning framework. Now we'll step through those on the next few slides just to give you a bit more detail. And probably the most important aspect for large generating systems is this new approach or tightened approach to compliance. So if you think back, one of the reasons for going down the path of introducing the generator performance standards for large generating systems was to provide greater clarity around the technical performance that is expected from those large generating systems. And what we expect then is that the network service provider and AEMO will assume that in the absence of any other information that those generating systems are capable of delivering there's the performance specified in the generator performance standards, and that they'll build that capability into their processes that they use to assess or secure technical envelopes for the power system. So within that framework then it becomes quite important that the compliance regime encourages those large generators or those generators that can have a significant impact on system security to have appropriate incentives to continually review and assess their ability to meet their generator performance standards. So this is achieved by introducing a requirement for ongoing performance monitoring and a requirement for sharing the outcomes, the records from that compliance monitoring process with the NSP. We've decided again to be very consistent with what's in the WEM rules, and we've achieved that by making use of the guidelines within the WEM rules that AEMO has to produce for the compliance monitoring program. So there's a template there that AEMO needs to produce, and the technical rules require that any compliance monitoring program produced under the technical rules must also comply with the same template. And so what you're seeing here are very similar to the GPS arrangements. If you're a large generator, you'll either have a compliance monitoring program established via the WEM rules process, or you'll have one established via the technical rules process. And because they reference back to the same template, they'll be quite similar in either case. So there's no particular difference that should result from establishing your compliance regime via the WEM rules or the technical rules. Again, there's a need to update that compliance regime as we spoke of, if there's any relevant augmentation. We've also reflected a need to update the compliance monitoring programs should AEMO change the template. That particular approach is very similar to the compliance approach that's been running now for many years within the NEM framework. And the last thing we've included is that the compliance programs, the registered performance standards should all be retained and accessible in a database maintained by the network service provider, or register maintained by the network service provider. So the question that arises when you look at that ongoing compliance regime is, well, what if during the execution of the monitoring program, the generator identifies that for one reason or another, the generating system is no longer able to comply with one aspect of their generator performance standard? And so to address that, we've introduced a rectification process, very similar again to what's in the WEM rules. So that process is really described by the dot points that follow. So it requires prompt notification of any non-compliance to the NSP. Following on from that, the generator has to propose a rectification plan, and that needs to include any remedial measures and the timetable for implementing those measures. That remediation plan is negotiated, the rectification plan is negotiated with the NSP, and if necessary, the NSP will consult with AEMO in that process. So finally, you get an agreed rectification plan. The generator then is expected to execute that plan and conduct appropriate compliance tests to demonstrate that it's been successfully delivered. Across the period where the rectification plan is running, the generator needs to keep the NSP advised on progress and identify any issues that arise in meeting the plan. So remember, the plan includes a timeline. And out of that, there's also then a process for being able to renegotiate amendments to the rectification plan, should that be necessary. So just as a summary, this slide just gives you a high-level summary of the key changes that have been made then around compliance. And most of the ones are really focused on what it means for large generators. That's where most of the changes have been made. And for smaller generators, we've really retained the existing arrangements. So what that means for them is they need to demonstrate compliance at the time of commissioning. There's a general provision that remains within Chapter 4 that allows for the NSP to monitor performance of the power system and of user facilities. And they can, if they suspect, say that a small generating system was no longer meeting compliance obligations, they could use those facilities, those processes within Chapter 4 to investigate the matter and bring it to resolution. But we're not putting an ongoing compliance obligation on small generators because we thought that would be disproportionate in terms of the costs it would impose on small generators compared to the benefits it might give rise to in terms of improved system security. We also, as I mentioned earlier, introduced a few changes to the remainder of Chapter 4. So these mainly touch on things like commissioning and inspection and testing. So some of those revisions that have been highlighted on this slide include we've suggested restricting the rights to inspect facilities to just the NSP and AEMO. The current drafting is a bit more open and could be interpreted as allowing that right for inspection to be much broader. We believe that's probably unintended, and so it's appropriate to tighten it up. We've proposed clarifying the qualifications required for people to undertake testing. Again, this is to provide then some useful guidance to users, because it's not always the case that the user is completely across the appropriate qualifications for someone who's going to do the testing and, say, produce model validation results. We've clarified when models need to be updated following tests, and we've introduced a new process that enables the network service provider to request information from a user regarding their facility. The feedback we received through the working group was that generally, in a lot of cases, it's far more useful to request information about a user's facility than it is to actually go to site and try and gain that information or understanding through an inspection process. So it's less intrusive for the user, and is generally a more productive approach. The current drafting doesn't provide for that explicit option, so we thought it was useful to include it. And we mentioned when we were going through the previous section, the approval to generate framework. So we've introduced that into Chapter 4. Again, that means that you've got a very consistent framework in Chapter 4 as you do have in the WEM rules. And it provides for this two-stage process. So you have interim approvals that are issued and they facilitate testing of generator facilities. And that testing is used primarily to be able to demonstrate that a generating facility is meeting its performance standards. Once you get through that successful testing, then your interim approval is rescinded and replaced by a formal approval to generate. So it's just another series of checks and balances, if you like, as you go through that commissioning process. All right, so that's me having done quite a lot of talking now for a while. I'm going to pause at this point and just see if we've got any questions. So over to you, Sabina, and the moderators at Western Power.
Hi, David. Thank you. We've just got one question that came through regarding generator modeling, and it's about, I'll read the question for you. It's more of a concern that Dixieland Power Factory having monopoly in the modeling market in WA, and there's almost a complaint on prices are continuing to increase. So that's something that is not directly relevant to the technical rules and the discussions that's been happening here. Western Power uses Dixieland, but customers can source their own software engineers who know Dixieland and can do it by themselves. They don't even have to go to Dixieland as a business, as a company. But because Western Power is limited to this software, there isn't any other way around it. But that's kind of beyond what we're discussing here on the rules. So this is something we can take offline and can have a further discussion with Tim Edwards.
Yeah, and that's probably something also that's more in the context, Sabina, of why you go down the path of having the generator load and modelling guidelines, because then matters like that can be debated and resolved and discussed through those guidelines rather than revisions to the rules as such.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, then I think I'll hand over to you, Sabina, to talk us through the way ahead from here.
Okay, awesome. Okay, thank you. Thank you all for hanging in there and patiently listening. We have another session coming up tomorrow on the changes for small users. If you haven't registered already, you can still do. Further to that, on Friday, we will upload a draft copy of the relevant chapters of the technical rules along with the slides and the video link from today and from tomorrow. We will send an email with a link to the webpage on Friday, the 11th of June. Further to that, Western Power is seeking any feedback. It's open for feedback until the 30th of June. So if you have any questions that you didn't think of today, or you have any further feedback on what was presented here today, please do contact us before this date and we'll try to answer them. After that, we've got the submission that happens to ERA, which is scheduled for the 30th of July. So once we've submitted the technical rules, the draft, then from August to March 2022, there will be under ERA's control, and there would be several opportunities for public consultation, which ERA will lead, and customers can provide their feedback through that process. And it's expected at this stage that the rules, if all goes well, will be approved by March 2022. And thereafter, it will take effect. So in the meantime, there's an email that's given there. So any feedback is to be sent to technical.rules.review@westernpower.com. So all this information will be sent by email to those who registered. Thank you. Has that been a new? Okay, thank you very much. All right, so next we'll see you in tomorrow's session if you have registered. Okay.